We're joined right now by former federal prosecutor, friend of the program, Neama Rahmani. Neama, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Exactly what does this ruling mean? What is being held in criminal contempt?
Andy, this is unprecedented. It seems like every day I'm coming on Live Now saying something is unprecedented, but holding the government in contempt almost never happens. So this is what this means. The judge in this case, Boasberg, has determined that there's probable cause. That means there's sufficient evidence that the government ignored his order. When we're talking about the temporary restraining order to prevent removals of individuals from the United States. So when those planes took off in violation of the judge's order, the government appears to have broken the law. So what happens now? Well, we know that the executive branch, they're the ones who enforce the law. So now you have this situation where Boasberg is telling the government to essentially prosecute itself. So again, unprecedented. I don't think the Department of Justice is going to comply with that order. Obviously, they're going to appeal. The DOJ has already said that they plan to appeal this case. I think what will happen is case will have to appoint a special prosecutor. I think that's what's going to have to happen here.
It's going to be very interesting because you mentioned they're holding the government in contempt. Who are the defendants? Who might potentially, if they do enforce it, be held specifically, an individual?
There would be very specific individuals that Boasberg would have to identify, because you're right, you can't hold the government, the United States, in contempt, or the Department of Justice. It would have to be very specific individuals. And when you talk about criminal contempt, you're talking about someone being jailed. So this is pretty serious stuff here, but the question is, of course, if the U.S. Marshals were to come arrest someone, those marshals are employees of the Department of Justice. So is Pam Bondi and her folks going to prosecute lawyers for the Department of Justice, DHS officials? I mean, we're really at the precipice and the cusp of a potential constitutional crisis here.
Yeah, and it's a question of who and how high up. Another question I have to ask is about the jurisdiction, because the Supreme Court already ruled in terms of this that the lawsuit was in the wrong venue, taking it away from Boasberg. Does Boasberg even have the jurisdiction to make a ruling like this?
Potentially not. And this was an important decision by the Supreme Court. And the question is, where do individuals have to file? And when we're talking about nationwide injunctions and whether they're appropriate or not, the court has said, really, the jurisdiction venue is appropriate where the individual is being held. And they should really pursue this through habeas relief, as opposed to, a class action challenging the use of the Alien Enemies Act. So that's very important as well. It's certainly one of the good arguments that the government has. This will absolutely be appealed. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up before the Supreme Court. Again, we're talking about a very, very important issue. A district judge, the chief district judge there in D.C., holding the United States government in contempt. And ultimately, if the Supreme Court decides that this is appropriate after the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals rules, question is, what's going to happen next? I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with an Rule 42 special prosecutor, and I'll explain what that is. Again, rarely used rule of criminal procedure where a district judge can appoint a special prosecutor to prosecute the Department of Justice when they have a conflict or they refuse to act. So that's the direction we may be headed here if, again, the appellate courts rule that this criminal contempt order is lawful.
And that is obviously the next step. And it is a little bit of confusing because this happens so rarely. Can you give me some understanding of what that might look like, the logistics of that?
I think what it might look like is what we saw in New York, where the judge in that case appointed Paul Clement as a special counsel to determine whether the Department of Justice was acting appropriately when they dismissed the charges against Mayor Eric Adams. In that case, there's a new Department of Justice, new Attorney General, and we talked about it a lot on the show, where the local U.S. Attorney's Office there, they did not want to dismiss the charges against Mayor Adams. Main justice in D.C., they stepped in And there was a hearing, and at that hearing, obviously, Adams's lawyers wanted the case dismissed. The Department of Justice wanted the case dismissed. So everyone was in agreement, but the judge said, well, wait, maybe the DOJ is doing things improperly. So there, the judge appointed Paul Clement, who is a former Solicitor General, very well respected, even in Republican circles. He's a conservative. And he came and advised the judge and said that not only is dismissal appropriate, it really should be with prejudice. Again, something that you rarely see when you have a judge saying, I want a lawyer to investigate the DOJ. But I think that's the direction we're headed in.
And it could be happening very soon. And of course, we also know about another case. We talk about the Maryland man wrongfully deported, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. These two very unrelated, but the White House, the Trump administration said they're complying with this. If this reaches the Supreme Court level, which potentially in likelihood it will, do you think the Supreme Court and the justices there will have the feeling that they need to be more specific in terms of the language, because people are reading that ruling a little bit differently, the 9-0 ruling for that to facilitate the return of that Maryland man? Do you think that if and when it reaches the Supreme Court, they'll be more specific in their rulings?
Potentially, yes, Andy, but there's really not a lot the courts can do here. So in Abrego Garcia's case, obviously, he's deported in violation of an immigration judge order unlawfully. The government admitted that it was a mistake, but there's nothing the courts, even the Supreme Court, can do to force the executive branch to conduct foreign policy. So an example is, let's say I, as a U.S. citizen, I'm abducted, I'm held overseas. I'm a U.S. citizen. There's nothing the Supreme Court can do to force the president to go in and rescue me. So that's really completely something that is within the domain and authority of the executive branch. We're talking about foreign policy here. So even if a mistake was made, we're really stuck in a position where, you know, maybe there's a criminal contempt order, maybe someone is jailed or fined. But as far as actually a remedy to go get that individual, that's not possible. At most, what the government has to do is, if Abrego Garcia is returned to the United States, to allow him back into the United States. But there's nothing even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court can do to force Donald Trump to go to El Salvador and even ask for his return.
Yeah, and that's what we were talking about earlier this week. This may be not necessarily a legal matter anymore, a foreign affairs matter instead. Neama Rahmani, any parting words? Because this is so very fascinating, a topic as criminal contempt, the Trump administration being held there as those probable cause orders from Boasberg. Anything else on your mind that you want to talk about before I let you go?
It's a fascinating time, and when it comes to constitutional law, I think the most important thing viewers need to know is, when it comes to enforcing the law and when it comes to foreign policy, that is a responsibility of the executive branch and Donald Trump. So whether it's Congress, whether it's the courts, they really can't force his hand here, even if he may be doing something unlawful.
All right, very good. Neama Rahmani, thank you so much. I appreciate your perspective, your insight. Thanks again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks, Andy.